So just a quick preview of what we're going to cover in this webinar. I'm going to go over types of Google Drive just to level set with everybody so that they understand what Google Drive is and how it works from a permissions and security issue. We'll talk about the permissions model, how you can set things up and what that means. Academic and research use, because this is a webinar focused on the academic and research community, we'll talk a bit about that. And then we'll go into the challenges, talking about the problems you can run into when you're sharing documents, trying to revoke access, by like offboarding somebody and transferring ownership, and whether ransomware is a threat or not. And then finally, we'll go through some actual solutions to these issues, reviewing permissions on your own, setting policy, doing backups of Google Drive itself, and also considering the advantages of Google Shared Drive. So this is a presentation brought to you by ResearchSOC. Just a bit about ResearchSOC. It's a security operations center for the research community, providing services from log analysis to vulnerability scanning, and even setting up honeypots. This is a collaboration between Indiana University, University of San Diego, University of California, San Diego, Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, and Duke. And there'll be more about ResearchSOC at the end of this presentation. So what happened to our intro slides? Okay. Before we get into this, I wanted to just tell you.
I think it's at the beginning, that's slide number 2. It's right there at the beginning.
Ishan, could you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell a little bit about yourself? Thanks.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Ishan Abhinit. I'm a senior security analyst here at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research, Indiana University. And I have been with CACR for 2.5 years. Previously, I have worked at IBM India Private Limited and Infosys Limited back in India. And I'm a recent master, not recent now, it's been 2.5 years almost. So I'm a master's student in cybersecurity from Northeastern University, Boston. So that's a bit about me. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Ishan. So I'm Mark Krenz. I am a chief security analyst here at the Center for Applied Cybersecurity Research at Indiana University. I'm also the chief information security officer for the ResearchSOC. I am the deputy chief information security officer for Trusted CI. I've been involved with cybersecurity for about 9 years now professionally. Before that, I was a system administrator for about 15 years. And I wrote the program CloudPerm. I'm the original author of the program CloudPerm, which we'll be talking about later, as a solution for auditing Google Drive permissions. So again, getting into just an introduction to Google Drive so that you can understand what we're talking about if you're not too familiar with it. The first thing is, there's a few different types of Google Drive, and I've kind of generalized this here. There's the normal Google Drive that you get when you set up a Google Drive account, like on Gmail or with your personal email account, and that gives you access to just some of the basic features. You get like 15 gigabytes worth of storage, I think, by default. You can share files with your friends or colleagues. And you can collaboratively edit documents using Google Docs, which tightly integrates into Google Drive. And then if you're willing to pay for additional features and have kind of a contract with Google and get additional features like agreements around data usage and so on, then you can subscribe to what's called G Suite for Enterprise or G Suite for Education. It has a few different names. And also different levels that you can subscribe at. And that gives like an institution or larger organization the ability to have more control over how the data is used by Google. It's like you probably are aware that information that you share with Google is used for advertising purposes and so on. So you have a bit more control over that. And with that, you're given the ability to administrate, like for your domain, how people on your domain are using Google Drive. So you get a little bit more features there. And then a newer feature that was formerly called Google Team Drive and has since renamed itself to Google Shared Drive, which might be a little bit confusing, is one that changes the way the permissions model works. Instead of having individuals owning files, the big difference is that the organization owns files and you have managers of the data. And that way you don't run into problems with ownership transfers like you do with normal Google Drive or G Suite for Education. We'll talk more about that towards the end of the presentation. The other thing to keep in mind is that Google Drive may seem like a file system hierarchy like you would see on your computer, but it's really an object storage system. And it's kind of subtle, the difference between that from a user perspective, but it makes things like being able to put a file in multiple folders possible. A Google Doc file can be placed in multiple different folders, and it's actually the same file. If you're familiar with how a Unix file system works, it's kind of analogous to a hard link instead of a symlink. Although Google has actually changed this recently, and now they make it so that when you do this, you're actually making a shortcut. So it is more like a symlink now. But the way Google thinks of this internally is just like one big flat file system. Of course, even though they say it's an object storage system, it does have a lot of features that behave like a file system hierarchy, such as when you add permissions to a top-level folder and it applies them down the tree of folders. Oh, there's our intro slides. Okay, when I move them around, I just moved them too low in the slide list. Sorry. So access to files and to documents, and I'll say documents, and I mean by that files, folders, spreadsheets, slide decks like this one, which is actually on Google Docs, it's a document on Google Drive that uses the Google Slides application. So access to it is based on your email address, whether that's your email address at gmail.com or your personal email address or your work email address, like on a domain or something like that. And it will use whatever, identity management system is set up for that domain. So by default, you're just using Google's identity management system and whatever you have set up there. You may have two-step authentication set up with Google, so you'd have to go through that to log in. And then, providing access is based on your email address there. If you're using it through an institution, you can configure Google Drive to do the authentication through the institution. So you might have like a central authentication system that uses Duo or some other two-factor system for authentication and ties in with your institution's authentication system. If you add or remove access to a higher level folder, like if you have a top level folder and then subfolders underneath that and documents underneath that, the access will propagate down through the folders. And I put most of the time in here because we'll talk about in a bit how this doesn't always play out the way you expect it to. A file gets owned by the person who creates it. This is the case with normal Google Drive and G Suite for Education, but not necessarily with Google Shared Drive. Permissions can be changed by anybody who has edit access. So anybody who give editor control to a file can change the permissions. They can add and remove people all the way up to edit permission level. They can open the file up so it's visible to the public with the link and visible to the domain if you're using a G Suite for enterprise account. And the file owner, if they want to, they can prevent this type of editing. So they can prevent others from actually making permission changes. And that's done through the advanced settings and the sharing settings. Documents and folders, they can be restricted to just the owner. So if you want to just restrict a folder so that only the owner can see it, you can do that. You can share the document with others by putting in their email address and giving them different levels of access. You can share with others who have the document link. So the address that would be at the top of the browser in the address bar, you can just send that off to people. And then there's another level of sharing that has been deprecated in the last couple of years, but you used to be able to share with the public. you could, and this meant that the public could discover your Google document. Now they've removed this from the interface, but there are still files out there that are shared with the public in this way. I actually have one that I created a few years ago as a test, and it's still set to shared with public, but you can't do this with new files apparently. So they've removed that from the interface. You may still be able to possibly set it through the Google Drive API. I haven't tested that. And then documents in subfolders can be more restricted and more, so documents that are in restricted folders can be more permissive. So if you have like a top level folder that restricts access to just a small group of people, you can have a folder underneath that that expands upon those permissions and gives people more access. So this is different than say on a, on a Windows or Unix file system, where generally when you restrict access at a higher level folder, it restricts access to the subfolders as well. So a little case study, a lot of our knowledge came about through just using Google Drive. And as I mentioned, I'm the Deputy CISO on Trusted CI. I've been part of Trusted CI since, I think, 2015, 2016. We're a National Science Foundation funded project. We use Google Drive heavily, like all the time, and Google Docs all the time for doing collaborative editing of documents and comments and sharing information and so on. We have thousands of documents that we have to manage. And so a lot of these problems became evident very quickly and is the fundamental basis of a lot of our knowledge behind these issues with security. We're also a multi-institution team. And this is a commonality with a lot of academic projects, is that you have projects that are multiple teams from different institutions working together. This is very much in contrast to how things work out in the private sector, the government sector, where you often have just one institution that is able to view and collaborate on a set of documents, and you never collaborate with people outside the institution. If you do, it's usually through some kind of special partnership, and the access to information is very restricted, and it's not really in the interest of collaboration. It's for other reasons, making money. So the academic space is kind of a very unique use case, and Google may not have prepared for, maybe it wasn't prepared for that when they designed Google Drive. They weren't aware of how collaborative the academic space is. And so this presents problems. Trusted CI was using Google Drive several years before the G Suite for Education was available, or maybe even before G Suite for Enterprise, I'm not sure. But some people say, why didn't you just use G Suite for Education or Enterprise from the start? Well, it's because we were using it before that was available, and that was an option. We have a lot of external collaborators. We do engagements and so on with lots of different projects, and so we have to share documents with those projects as we work with them. And we have internal documents, that are classified as internal, that are restricted to just Trusted CI staff, and also public documents that we share, like the Trusted CI framework and stuff like that, that are intended to be shared with the public. So, we have this somewhat unique use case, maybe from Google's point of view, of, multi-institution teams and highly collaborative, and we need to move documents around between the teams and so on like that. Maybe they didn't fully prepare for that situation. And I think, this use case here is very similar to a lot of academic project use cases. Does anybody have any questions so far? I wanted to give a break in here for questions. Mostly about what Google Drive is. Okay, great. You all know what Google Drive is. So let's move into security concerns. Probably the biggest, the elephant in the room is sharing with link. So this comes up whenever you go into the sharing permissions and you say, I want to share the document to anybody on the internet who has the link to it. This originally was also tied to the get shareable link function. And I think is a big reason why so many documents got opened up over time is that it used to be when you would say get shareable link, it would automatically change the permissions on a document to be open to be shareable with the link. And people probably didn't realize that that was happening when they got the link to the document. We saw this early on with another project called The Swamp that I worked on, and we had to start restricting documents. This was back in like 2013, 2014. So it was kind of a Google Drive interface snafu where it was, you went to go do something kind of innocuous and ended up adding to your security risk. The things that you have to consider with this is that if somebody is offboarded with then they'd still have access to the link. So, if your model is based around just sharing with the link and passing the link around to the current staff, and you think that nobody else is going to have access to it, well, what happens when somebody leaves? They're still going to have the link someplace. It could potentially be linked from other documents that are more open. For instance, if you have, some document that goes over policy or something like that, and there's a link within it to a more restricted document, then that, somebody could discover the document that was meant to be more restricted just by having the link from the error document. You also have to consider that even with current staff only having the link, somebody's email could be compromised, and that would mean that an attacker could gain access to the file. There could be other ways that the link could become exposed. I wouldn't count on the ability of somebody to be able to randomly guess the document ID. That's unreasonable. I mean, the document IDs are long enough that brute forcing it would just take too long. And Google probably has some controls in place for stopping brute forcing attacks. Like they ask you for a CAPTCHA test or something like that after you've tried enough different combinations. So, here's an example of this is fake data. I created this fake document a few years ago for another presentation I did on Google Drive. But you can see here, this document has been opened up so anyone with the link can view. This is also a screenshot of the old interface. But you can see that there's this get shareable link option right here. Can you see my mouse, by the way, moving around? Okay. And when you clicked on that, it would automatically change the permissions so that it was anyone with the link can view. And so I think this was the root of when a lot of documents and folders ended up starting to be exposed, and this just kind of propagated through people's document trees and created this problem. Another big one that's wasn't so well known. I didn't discover it until earlier this year when a colleague mentioned it. And I was like, wow, that's a serious, kind of vulnerability. And recently has been come up in the news, which we'll talk about in a second, is when you go to share a file with the domain, you might think that when you go to share it with your domain, like for instance, if I share a document with Indiana University, anybody at Indiana University can see it. Initially, I thought that the only way to discover that would be if you had the link in some way. It turns out that it's actually possible to discover files that you don't have the link for, but have access to through people sharing stuff with the domain just by doing this keyword search source:_domain. And so this opens up the door for being able to see documents across like a university environment where you can see, students who are accidentally sharing files with the university by mistake, professors, and so on. And I've seen all kinds of documents being shared. I haven't actually looked at the files, but just doing this search, I've seen lots of different things being shared that were obviously not meant to be shared. So I don't think that they know what they're sharing. And the other thing is, why are people sharing so much? You might say, well, don't they intend to share that? Don't they know what they're doing? Again, I think it goes back to this problem of they originally clicked on get shareable link. Then later, when their institution may have turned on G Suite for Education it actually changed a lot of these anyone with the link can view to anyone within the domain can view. I don't have proof of this, but this is just kind of based on my observation of things, how things played out. So this is like another set of fake results that I made based on real results of a similar type. So you can see how when I went to go search for source : domain, I saw all kinds of different files, some people who had put passwords for websites and different kind of work data, maybe some sensitive information like tax documents, applications for jobs and stuff like that. I really don't think people meant to share this stuff. And so this is something that you have to be conscious of. I'll explain a little bit how you can actually search for files that you've accidentally shared in this way, so you can discover whether you've shared anything in this way. And people might think, people don't know about this problem, but people already do know about this problem. It's actually been a thread on Reddit, and admins have said, Google themselves had actually said, oh, if you want to search for stuff at your institution, you can search with source : domain. So this is a public forum document. It's already out there in the public that this is possible. Earlier in the summer when I did this presentation, I actually omitted some of these slides because I was afraid to kind of expose this, but it's public information now, so it needs to be dealt with. The changes that Google is going to be making in a couple weeks, where they're going to require people to request access to a file that they don't have access to, might fix this, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So look for that change. I think it's on September 15th or September 13th that they're going to be making that change. And you've probably received an email from them about that. And this has been in the news recently. So just this month, it came out that New York City schools exposed, they had a data link of Google Drive documents, and they exposed 3,000 New York City school students and 100 employees' data through a Google Drive exposure that basically was caused by permission setting mistake. Initially, there was just a little bit of detail that came out about it, but then there was a follow-up article that actually talked about a little bit more about the details. The students could access the files because of a quirk in the school's education department's Google Drive sharing settings. So students at Brooklyn Technical High School reportedly stumbled across a Google Drive containing documents uploaded by staff and students at schools across New York City. That across New York City tells me that they were finding this through like source : domain, or finding it because documents were shared with the domain. And this grew, this became more of a problem. So when they rechecked it again from between January and March, more documents were becoming accessible. So this is becoming a big problem that really needs to be dealt with. Revoking access. Sometimes when you go to revoke access from the top of the tree, it doesn't recurse through all the folders the way you intend it to. I think that there's hidden metadata within Google Drive that Google doesn't expose through the interface or even through the API to users who have API access that kind of keep track of whether a folder or a file was different somehow. And there's been cases where we've tried to remove people from a top level folder, and then it doesn't hit all the subfolders and stuff like that. And so later we discover through auditing permissions that they still had access for some reason. Obviously, they still retain access if those older users own a file. How are you going to handle ownership change if they're on two different domains? One of the problems with transferring ownership between domains, and this is a multi-institution problem, is that you can't transfer them between domains. For instance, you can transfer ownership from google.com, from gmail.com to gmail.com, or from iu.edu to iu.edu, but you can't transfer from gmail.com to iu.edu or vice versa. They just won't let it, they don't allow for that. As far as ownership change goes. If a former user owns a folder and you remove their access, then any new files that get created underneath that folder ends up with them gaining access to those new files. So this is like a repropagation of permissions that happens if you don't take care of the folder ownership change problem. There's also some other weird, unexplainable problems I just kind of put into a bucket there. And then, of course, they still know the document URL, so that if you're just sharing by link, they're still going to be able to go back and access things, potentially adding themselves back in to have permissions again if you're allowing edit access by link. So here's an example of the revoking access problem. Let's say we have a full, top level folder here, and then a subfolder with a different set of permissions. I say team B because let's say, you have like a kind of a Venn diagram or maybe a Euler diagram, depending on how you want to talk about it, where you have one set of people that is in group A, and then you have another set that's in group B, and then you have a group C. And this is just, by convention, it's not something that Google actually has as defined groups, unless you want to talk about groups.google.com, which I'll talk about later. And so you add a user at the top level, and it just happens to correctly propagate down the tree, adding their permissions to everything inside. Maybe you intend it to be that way, maybe you don't, but they've joined the organization, so now they have access to everything. Later, when you remove them from the base level folder because you're wanting to offboard them, then you can see that what ends up happening sometimes, I can't guarantee it will be all the time, but what we've observed is that some subfolder they'll retain access to, and maybe documents below that, and maybe another file or two here or there that they've retained access to. You may not notice this right away because you might be doing offboarding and onboarding only on the top level folder by looking at the sharing settings there. But we found that we had to look in subfolders and subfiles to be able to find what they really had access to. And then likewise on that, if you're giving somebody access to a higher level folder, they might gain access to a restricted subfolder. So going back here to when we add them in, maybe you didn't want them to gain access to this subfolder. And this actually happened with a few folders that we had, where we had subfolders that, we restricted the permission to them at some point, maybe an engagement or something like that. And we restricted the amount of people that had access to it just to those who had a need to know basis. When we added them in a higher level folder, Google propagated their permissions down to the new folder. And so we found that, it was a small group of people that had access to this folder, plus all the new people, that had been onboarded had access to it, but not a bunch of the old people. So, weird problems like that you have to be mindful of. Google doesn't have a great versatility with its permission system, so you have to watch out for these kind of problems. Again, like I said, transferring ownership between domain names is denied by Google, so there's not really a transparent way around that. We'll talk about some less perfect ways to get around those kind of things later. Some institutions might not use G Suite for education, so there might be features that you have that others don't have. You might want to have an agreement about the data, that's in use on your project. And maybe some of the files, depending on who creates them, are under that contract, and some are not under that contract, depending on whether the other institutions have this G Suite for education account. And differing security policies. You might have one institution could have two-factor turned on, the other one might not. This was, a problem that we had within Trusted CI, where we have a policy saying that you have to have two-factor authentication turned on your Google Drive account if you're going to have access to a special folder. And so we would have to check this manually. There's no way for us to enforce it really. And so we would go around and later, as institutions started signing on to having G Suite for education, they started integrating it into their two-factor authentication systems that they already had. So, we just had to check, does the whole institution have access to the two-factor? What happens when somebody leaves? Do they retain access? They still know the URLs. Are you going to be able to transfer files? I've talked about those things. What happens if they delete documents? So we've tested this, and like if they delete a folder, it does delete the folder, even if multiple other people have access to that. It'll suddenly go away, and all the files and folders inside of that will become orphans, and you have to find them and reattach them to another folder or something like that. The same is true as if they delete their account. So if they delete their account, I tested deleting an account, and immediately all the files inside become orphans. So this is something to consider when you're offboarding somebody, is you want to try to get ownership transferred over as soon as possible, so that you don't have to worry about these kind of issues coming up. Accidental deletion of documents. This was one of the early problems that we ran into. Google has made it pretty convenient to remove documents. I think a while back, they didn't even have a confirmation dialog that would come up. And so you could accidentally delete a document and maybe not even realize that you've done it. The other thing is, raise your hand if you've gotten less accurate with your mouse as you've gotten older, myself included. So you could accidentally open up a menu, mean to press something else, accidentally let up on the button and end up removing a document, and then maybe click on something too fast and confirm it. Or you might hit delete and enter really quickly accidentally when you brush your keyboard or something like that. So, I mean, this is the case with any type of file system. You could accidentally delete stuff, but it's something to consider because you might not realize that something is gone. Other people might not be going to that document for a while, and so trash documents end up being removed permanently after 20 to 30 days. And are you backing things up? A lot of people think of Google Drive as a way of backing stuff up from their computer, but they probably don't think of it the other way, backing up Google Drive to your computer. We ran into this problem a few times early on, and so we started actually backing up Google Drive and discovered some solutions for making it more efficient and easier to do. What about ransomware? So it's been proven in some articles that ransomware can affect Google Drive if you're using Google Drive Sync or Google Drive File Stream. These are features that Google has made for allowing you to mount a Google Drive folder and all the files underneath. It's not clear whether document versions would save you, so you could just roll back the document version to go back to the old version. It would depend on how the ransomware works. If the ransomware happens to delete the file before creating the encrypted version, you're going to lose all that metadata. It's not necessarily just creating a new version of the document. Also, through Google Drive Sync and File Stream, it might create a new document anyways when you go do stuff like that. We see, I'm sorry, I forgot what I was going to say. So yeah, ransomware is definitely an issue. It could also be an issue for instance, if you're using rclone or Google OCaml Fuse, which are solutions I'll talk about later. So you generally want to consider, restricting access to these add-ons by policy, or having it so that people restrict what folders they apply them to, so that you don't kind of mitigate ransomware. It's also a really good reason to be backing up Google Drive. Another feature that came up while we were writing this white paper about Google Drive security that's being published is that there's a live chat feature that's in Google Docs. Not everybody is going to have access to it, but users who are listed in the sharing settings explicitly might have access to this live chat feature. It shows up as an icon that looks like a person or something up by the avatars where you see other people's avatars showing up. I think it has an asterisk next to the person or something like that. We actually don't have that feature turned on at Indiana University, it would seem, but I do see it when I access my personal Gmail account. And I have talked to some other people at other institutions that do have it turned on. So it's not available everywhere, but the thing about this chat feature is it's fairly rudimentary. It allows people to talk to each other live, but the chat isn't logged, which maybe is a good thing, but it also makes it so that you can't go back and prove that somebody said something. It has no ability to report a user, like if they start to harass other users or something like that. I list this, this feature as something to be aware of, just in case somebody has a special use case where this could be a threat. Obviously, if you're adding people into sharing settings, you kind of know who they are and you can remove access. But of course, if you have an insider threat situation, you can have people adding anonymous accounts to the sharing settings because they have access to add more people. They could be adding a target or something to it and then waiting until they join the thing and then harassing them in some way. So just the same way that Zoom bombing is a problem, this could be a problem. Fortunately, the chat doesn't show up when you have a public document that's shared by link and only people who have access to it through the link go in. At least as in my testing, it doesn't show up that way. Okay, questions so far about all the problems before we move into solutions?
We have a couple questions here. The first one says, you say GD is an object store, but describe the details presuming a file system. Can you bridge the gap between the two?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Oh, so the question is, I guess earlier you said Google Drive is an object store, but describe the details presuming a file system. Can you bridge the gap between the two?
So I'm not sure what you mean by bridge the gap between the two, but I mean, the interface makes it look like a traditional file system. I'm just saying that on the back end, the way Google has it stored on their end is more like an object storage system. So where there's no real hierarchy to it or anything like that, it's less like a file system, more just like documents that are stored in a database or something like that. So the only reason I bring that up is so that there's certain things that model enables that's going to make it a little bit weird. Things that you would expect from a file system and maybe doesn't behave that way. This doesn't come up a lot, but I mean, it's something that early on people were calling out. They're like, oh, it's not a file system, it's an object storage system. So I'm not sure where that answers your question, but that's not sure what you mean by bridge between the two. You can certainly use, Google File Stream and Google Sync, you're kind of bridging between your local file system and Google Drive, if that's what you mean.
And then another question here, it said, how do you find and reattach orphan files?
Yeah, so we haven't tested how you would do that through the Google Drive interface. When we've done this testing, we've done it with a small set of files, and so it was relatively easy to find the files that were lost. The CloudPerm system that I'll be talking about later enables you to basically list out all the files with their document IDs. So one thing you could do is look at the output of that, and you could find all the files that were inside the folder previously, and then go to each one of them and then move them back into a parent folder someplace, or use an API program of some kind to move them back into place. You could also search for them by their name inside of the Google Drive system and then move them that way manually, but it would be tricky. It wouldn't just happen automatically. It can cause you some headaches. Any other questions?
We have one that just came in here. It says, how do we access Google Drive from a Linux HPC cluster?
So, okay, so I'll talk about a little bit later. There's some options for one way is through the Google Drive API, the application programmer interface. You could talk to the API directly and work with it that way. Some easier ways to work with it are to use a program called rclone, which lets you mount the file system, similarly to how you would do with Google File Stream. There's also Google OCaml Fuse, which is another method. Both of these require you to set up API access. So it's not just a matter of running these programs with the folder that you want to access. You have to go through and set up an API key. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on. Hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. I want to get through the solutions. So these are solutions that, I mean, we've enacted. There's definitely more problems than we're talking about in here and more solutions than we're showing here. This is pretty much just because we only had time to show this much. Even in the white paper that we published, after we finished, we realized we kind of forgot a few things. We could add a whole another 10 pages to the white paper of solutions and issues, but just due to time constraints, we had to cut it off. So there'll probably be a version 2. So the first one is, if you happen to be a G Suite administrator, you can do special things, and it's good to seek them out and build a relationship with them in case you do run into problems, so you can contact them quickly and maybe try to recover things or restrict access to things if you need to. They can recover files, they can check and set permissions and do special things. There's a tool that they can use that's called GAM that allows them to do a lot of things across the G Suite tool, G Suite application set, not just Google Drive, but across all of G Suite stuff. And do it in an automated way so that they can, quickly look at a bunch of permissions, quickly change a bunch of permissions, quickly recover a bunch of things and stuff like that. On the other end of the spectrum would be something that a normal user might be able to do. It requires that you have the ability to add add-ons to your Google Drive account, which, if you have a G Suite for Education account, you might not have this access, but it doesn't require API access. So you don't have to set up like an API key. It's available in the menu, and you can just search for add-ons and add stuff to it. But I would strongly caution you about this solution, because when you do this, you're basically granting the third-party developer access to all your stuff. And you'll see this when you go to add the permissions. It'll give you, a sternly worded warning saying you're granting this developer access to be able to view, delete, edit, remove all your Google Drive files. And that's really true. Potentially even running plugins on your behalf, doing stuff as you. So you want to be careful with that. And that was something that was unacceptable for us within Trusted CI. We're not going to give third-party access to a developer. So something to be mindful of. CloudPerm is a solution that I developed as a medium point between these two extremes. We didn't have G Suite for Education. We also didn't have a G Suite admin account. So we had no ability to do those kind of things. And we didn't want to use an add-on and give third-party access to somebody. So this allows non-administrators to access their Google Drive permissions and audit them, view them. There's a program in there for revoking permissions. That way you can kind of go through and automatically revoke a lot of permissions at once. It's still very much in alpha/beta phase, but there's a link there if you want to download and try it. I'm working on adding new features. I hired an intern over the last 6 months who had helped me to expand upon those features and trying to turn it into a nicer kind of enterprise level tool. But we've used this to discover lots of problems where people had access to whole trees and we weren't aware of it. And then we could go through and just remove their access in bulk really quickly. Because with thousands of files, you can't hope to do this manually on every file and check every file. It would be insane. It would take you forever. So this allows you to kind of automate that process. So yeah, what are you sharing with the domain? Here's another, I talked before about if you're sharing files with the domain, that can be a problem. What about if you want to check to see what you've shared with the domain? You can actually search in the Google Drive UI in the search bar, say owner:me space source:domain to see if anything shows up. And then, what would show up would be stuff you're sharing with your institution. And you want to consider on all of these, do you mean to be sharing that with your institution? Because there's probably people going through and just searching for source:domain, trying to find stuff that people are missharing. This is something else that we discovered while we were writing the paper. You may have heard of groups.google.com, which was the Usenet replacement. It was originally a Usenet archive, if you remember what Usenet was from so long ago. Google created this Google Groups that allowed people to create like forums and groups that people that could talk to each other, kind of like mailing lists and Usenet together. And recently, I don't know when they made this change, but you can now make it so that a Google group can have access to a document, like a folder or a file. So you can use it as an IAM solution. You can create a group, add people to that group, and then give that whole group access to a document or a folder, a file or a folder. You can also, if you give people access at a lower level, like just viewer only, you can still give people more permissions. Like if you want to give some specific member of that group more permissions, you can do that by adding them to the sharing permissions, but you can't restrict access or remove it from somebody who's in that group. So say if you wanted just one person, you had a document that was about somebody's birthday that was at work and you didn't want them to see it. You can't like do something like add the whole work group to that document and then remove access for just that person's who has the birthday from the document. You'd have to add every person individually to the document in order to do that. So, but I mean, it does make it so that it's a little bit easier to offboard people because you can have groups for like management, support, IT, marketing, and stuff like that. And you can just onboard them in specific groups and offboard them. And you don't have to worry about these issues with, at least I don't think so. You don't have to worry about issues of removing at the top level and it doesn't remove from all the sub levels or something like that. Setting policy. So one thing that we've done within Trusted CI and Research SOC is we've set up Google Drive policies that, how you access the Google Drive, from what accounts, that you're using two-factor, that you're using a strong password and stuff like that. These aren't things that we can necessarily enforce, but because we can't control Google Drive at that level, but we can at least educate people about the risks and let them know and tell them, it's not okay to use Google Drive in this way or something. Like we don't want people using add-ons unless they're approved by us. So we have like an approved set of add-ons. And then, we have restrictions on mounting and syncing software because of the risk of ransomware. Another thing that we've done is to make auditing easier. Because we're never sure, you can't indicate through the sharing settings what your intention to share was. Like, is it meant to be internal or is it meant to be shared with this other set of email addresses or is it meant to be shared by link? That we have these tags that we put at the end of file names. And here's a sample of some of them. There's more in the white paper. But they're basically, to indicate to the auditing staff and eventually to automated software, what the sharing intention was, so it can alert based on whether there's people who have permissions that it's different than what's intended to be shared. Backing up Google Drive. So again, deleted files are gone after 20 or 30 days. They might not be noticed. You have to protect against things like ransomware. You'll want to consider that backing up Google Drive can take a long time. It can take a day, depending on how much stuff you have. I've seen Google Drives that have had as much as 70 gigabytes worth of files and over 10,000 files. Maybe even, I've seen one that has 26,000 files. So you can have fairly large Google Drives that take a long time to download. So you need to think about that. You might also be surprised by how much you're downloading. So you definitely want to, first do this on a machine with plenty of space. A couple of tools that you can look into for helping you do this easier than through the interface would be to use Google OCaml Fuse. This is a Fuse file system for Linux module that lets you mount it like you would, an NFS, NFS mount. I'm always questioning myself about the acronym there. So And then rclone, which is another similar tool that you basically have to set up an API key for, and it lets you mount stuff. Google Shared Drive, this was formerly called Team Drive, and Ishan will start talking about Google Shared Drive and it as a solution.
Sure, thank you, Mark. So Google Shared Drive, as we know, Google Shared Drive was formerly known as Google Team Drive. And in Shared Drive, files are owned by the organization rather than the single user. Unlike the files in My Drive, files in Shared Drive belong to the team instead of an individual. So if the members leave, the files stay exactly where they are, so your team can continue to share the information and get the work done. And it also provides you with different roles that can be assigned to individual users. Roles are like a manager, content manager, contributor, commenter, and viewer. So if your organization is already not using this, you should start using it before it's too late. And it will also solve some of the permission issues and final ownership issues. Mark, can you move on to the next slide? Thank you. So cross-domain file ownership transfer. This was one of the biggest problems that we used to encounter, transferring the ownership of files when someone would leave an organization. According to Google, you can only transfer the ownership of files within your work or school. That means if I own some files with my IU domain, I can't transfer the ownership of these files to someone else at some other domain like Gmail. So it was a big issue for us, especially in projects like Trusted CI, Research SOC, when somebody would leave and we would have to manually take ownership of each of their files by creating a copy and then deleting the older ones. So very recently, we found a solution. This solution requires creating a shared drive. The next thing is to add the current owner and the to-be owner of the files as a member of shared drive. Even if these two members they belong to a different domain, you can add them to the same shared drive, and that is how the magic tunnel works. Next, the person leaving or the original owner transfer their files to the shared drive. When they transfer their files to the shared drive, the drive becomes owner of these files. Next, the new owner would transfer the files from shared drive back to where they originally belonged and they own it. So there are things that you need to think about before using this method. The good stuff about this method is it preserves the metadata and it also preserves the file URL. We have tested this and it works. There are a few caveats that you have to think about, like folders cannot be transferred, permissions are not preserved, file hierarchy is not preserved and will be lost. Currently, Mark is developing a program that would put the files back to where they originally belonged in the file hierarchy. Mark, can you go on to the next slide? Thank you. So Google Shared Drive, some more information, deep dive. So files can be moved from My Drive to Shared Drive or from one shared drive to another. Moving files and folders to a shared drive changes the ownership from user to the shared drive. When you move a file to a shared drive, only the members of the shared drive and the people the file is directly shared with can access that file. If the original owner of the file is within your organization, but not a member of shared drive, they lose the ownership, but still can access the file as its creator. Files and folders moved to shared drive don't remain in other users' drive locations, such as My Drive, but are accessible from the users shared with me and recent views. You can also collaborate with other users from other domains. By that, I mean the external users. The shared drive appears in the external user's Google Drive. Any work an external user contributes, for example, if they create a file, if they upload a file, or if they have made any changes to the file, will be owned by the domain that created the shared drive. It won't be owned by the user. You and the other admins can migrate the folders or files owned by external users, even if the external user is a member of destination shared drive. Another thing about Google Shared Drive is when as a G Suite administrator, you can restore files that were deleted from shared drive. If the entire shared drive is deleted, then also you can restore the shared drive and all of its contents. Shared drive also has some limitations. Shared drive can contain a maximum of 400,000 files and folders. A given file within a shared drive can be directly shared with a maximum of 100 groups. A folder in a shared drive can support up to 20 levels of nested folders. Moving files from shared drive to my drive and vice versa does not change the URL or the shared link of the files. Moving the files from one shared drive to another shared drive does not change the URL of the files either. Again, we have tested this and it works. Access permissions. There are two classes of permissions in shared drive. Users can be granted access to a shared drive itself when they access all the files, where they can access all the files and folders within the shared drive. Users can be granted access to a specific folders in shared drive on the need to know basis as well. Mark, could you move on to the next slide? So these are the things that we covered in today's webinar, some of the concerns that we shared and the solutions that we have provided. And if you want to have more information on these, you can also go ahead and see our white paper that might have been shared by Gregory just before today's webinar. Go ahead, Mark, next slide.
So these are some questions that we got during the registration process. I wanted to thank people for doing that, because even though we might not be able to give you a full answer to some of these questions, it does help us understand where we should focus our time, what's of interest to the community. So one of the questions that came in, and I was able to seek out the answers to some of these through some of my colleagues, so thank you to my colleagues for that. Is Google Drive security HIPAA compliant? So according to a colleague of mine who specializes in this, he says Google has HIPAA safeguards in place at their end, but this does not make one HIPAA compliant. All relevant HIPAA safeguards have to be put in place at the user end as well. It's essentially a shared responsibility model. Can we share best practices for Google Drive as a platform for storing and sharing protected human subject research data, kind of along the same lines? It's not about best practices. You have to implement all HIPAA safeguards and document them. You also have to have a HIPAA business associate agreement with Google. So, there's ways of doing it, but you have to, you probably have to talk to Google about it. How to mitigate to shared drive when you have hundreds of documents owned by many people, some of whom are not around. So we talked about that a bit when we were talking about ownership transfer, and it's not necessarily a perfect solution, but it's a potentially workable solution. And with all these questions and all these solutions, there's one thing you have to keep in mind is that Google Drive is a live application that could change at any moment. Even while we were doing the rehearsal yesterday, you'll notice, if any of you have ever done like a Google Drive presentation, you'll notice that this bar down here for presentation has actually changed. And I think just in the past week or something, because when I did it like a week or two ago, it was the old toolbar style. And now they've changed the way this looks, and they've added more features. So all of a sudden they can make a change that makes things work in a way that they didn't before, or breaks things. Like for instance, there was a keyword search 2: if you want to see who something was shared with. It stopped working last April, and they have not fixed it since. And I've tried to get a hold of them about it, and they haven't fixed it. So anyways, so this is a problem, moving documents between people. We talked about that. How are their solutions implemented with Globus and rclone? So Globus, they have a connector for it. I'm not super familiar with that. But that does help us to understand that that's something we should focus on in the future. So we'll probably look into that. rclone, as I mentioned, you can connect rclone with Google Drive. What are the security concerns when connecting to a Globus connection during account creation? So again, this is something that we'll have to look into more to give some recommendations there. So does device profiling exist with Google Drive to ensure computers are encrypted before data synchronization? The G Suite admins do have some ability to actually look at device profile information, like what type of browser and what type of operating system you're using. I don't think that they would be able to see whether a file system is encrypted. If that's what you're talking about, like file system level encryption, I don't even think the browser would have the ability to tell unless there's something exposed through the operating system that the browser could check. So the answer to that basically is no. I don't think that that's possible right now. Lack of enterprise features, logging, DLP, enforcement of internal policies. So this is more, I don't know where this is just a statement about this. There are options for doing data loss prevention. There's a link here that will be in the slides that will go out where it talks more about what things that you can do to do data loss prevention. There's also ways of actually seeing whether a file has been accessed. If you have specific access to a file within, I think it's within G Suite for Education, you might notice a little stock ticker like symbol, like going up arrow. It's up by the avatars, like who's viewing the file. That will show you information about who has viewed the file like over the past several months and give you some statistics. So you can actually see it that way. The G Suite admin also has some ability to see this information on a domain-wide basis. And then the rest of these, I think we answered, throughout the presentation. The only thing I wasn't sure of is are there tools for faster data? I'm not sure what that means. So if you want to clarify what you mean by that, but we'll take any questions now if you have them. Anybody have any other questions?
Mark, there are some questions in the chat.
Okay, I'm gonna have to try to bring up the chat window. Before we go on, please do connect with ResearchSoc to find out more information about the services that we have available and the development of our project and of our services. We also have a community of practice if you want to ask questions about cybersecurity and cyber infrastructure. There's a link to that. And follow our Twitter account and so on. With that, I also want to thank everybody for attending, but now I will stop sharing so I can actually read the questions. Okay, answered that. Do you have any repository of use for GAM scripts? So the GAM, I provide a link to the GAM GitHub repository. I would talk to that community directly to ask them. I'm not a G Suite administrator, so I don't know. But I've noticed that when I've looked at that code, that there are some examples and sample scripts and stuff in the code somewhere, or in their documentation. Couldn't you automate folder transfers to shared drive using GAM? From what I understand, the G Suite administrators still don't have the ability to do some of these things. So even stuff that the user can't do, the G Suite administrator can't necessarily do it either if it goes against like Google Drive's policy. We've asked some G Suite administrators and they said, no, we can't do that. Because otherwise we would just, it would be something like, let's just switch to Google Shared Drive. So we can eliminate a lot of these problems. Can a G Suite administrator access my data? I'm pretty sure the answer is yes to that. But it's like a system administrator that has access to data on a file store. Is GD available for Linux? So I'm assuming you're saying, is Google Drive available for Linux? And the answer to that is most definitely yes. I'm using Linux. And I access Google Drive through my browser. I also, we had a backup server that runs Linux that actually connects over Google or Camel Fuse for transferring files for the purpose of the backups. And I use CloudPerm, and Ishan uses CloudPerm to access the API from a Linux host. So yes, you can access it from Linux just fine.
Thank you, Mark and Ishan, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Like I said earlier at the beginning, the slides will be shared with the community and the recording will be available as soon as we're done editing. If you also have a few more questions, I'm guessing Mark and Ishan, are you available to take one or two more? Or
yeah, I can wait around.
All right.
Thanks everybody for attending.